Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, and share buttons. Well, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that coming into 2023, we talked about one of the top trends to look for was a coming global depression. And guys, I don't know what you're seeing on the ground, but I look at what I'm seeing on the ground, and I think it has begun, and I believe 2024 will be known as the year of the global depression. While the mainstream media says, oh, everything's fine, the economy is robust, well, everything we see indicates otherwise. And today, I've done a number of videos on this subject this year because I think it is a big deal with direct implications for the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And I believe that we're going to look at some headlines today, some data today, that I believe confirm that this is taking place and that we are headed straight toward a global, worldwide depression akin to the Great Depression. So let's dive right into the data and see what we're talking about. This first article I want to look at is from the New York Post. Now keep in mind when we look at this, 70% of the U.S. economy is consumer spending, or at least that's what they tell us. I don't know that necessarily believe the mainstream narratives, but it's a lot, guys. 70% or thereabouts of consumer spending is the U.S. economy, which is the largest economy in the world, aside from, the European Union and the UK. If you count those collectively, I believe they're slightly bigger, at least they were at one time. But anyway, the U.S. economy is very large with global implications. Consumer spending is very important. And guys, the U.S. consumer is tapped out. That's what this article tells us right here. This says credit card and car loan defaults hit 10-year high as inflation squeezes families. It says inflation squeezed Americans are defaulting on credit cards and auto loans at levels not seen since the financial crisis. So they're talking about the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. And the struggle to pay their bills is poised to get worse as interest rates rise and the moratorium on student loans expires. Low and middle income earners have been hit especially hard by soaring prices on everything from rent, groceries, new and used cars, despite the Federal Reserve's attempts to tamp down stubbornly high inflation. This year, credit card delinquencies have hit 3.8%, while 3.6% have defaulted on their car loans. Both figures are the highest in more than 10 years. The increase in delinquencies and defaults is symptomatic of the tough decisions that these households are having to make right now, whether to pay their credit card bills, their rent, or buy groceries, Mark Zandi, chief economist at Moody's Analytics, told the Washington Post. With any savings from pandemic-era government stimulus checks dried up, many stretched borrowers have turned to opening new lines of credit, even as the average interest rate hit a record 20.6%, according to Bankrate.com, to try to pay off their bills. And I love this pandemic-era stimulus checks. They keep saying this in all these stories all year. These are coming to an end. People are using up their excess savings. Guys, what were these checks? $2,000? And they went out like over 2 years ago. These were spent a long time ago. What's really created this buoyant economy with the inflation is not having to pay your rent, not having to pay your mortgage, and now all of a sudden people maybe have to, not having to pay student loans for 3+ years. And of course, many people were living paycheck to paycheck, and then inflation came along, and now they're struggling to make ends meet. So this isn't about, well, they've used up those $2,000 checks they got. I mean, come on. Nobody was living for years off of a $2,000 check. So this is the whole gamut, all of these spending programs that they threw out there that created this inflation to begin with. They created currency and kept people from producing. You're going to get inflation. So it says there are 70 million more credit card accounts open now than before the pandemic in 2019, and credit card debt surpassed $1 trillion for the first time ever, according to the New York Federal Reserve. Vulnerable individuals already squeezed by high rents and grocery prices will also need to start making student loan payments next month after their debts were paused for more than 3 years. And guys, I cannot underscore how important that is. That fact alone may be what tips not just the United States into depression, but the entire world, because you have tens of millions of student loan borrowers who owe an average of $400 a month that they haven't paid for over 3 years. They've been told by politicians, oh, we're going to forgive this debt. So only around, I think, 1% of those tens of millions of borrowers have made any payments at all over the last 3 years. Why would they when these politicians keep saying, we're going to forgive that student loan debt? Well, that hasn't happened. And many people made decisions believing that was going to happen. You know, we can all say, well, that's their own fault, but we're all going to pay the price for that because people went out and they spent in a way that they couldn't. They now have new expenses and can't make these payments. In some cases, again, people who were living paycheck to paycheck before, maybe they were just barely able to make these student loan payments and all their other payments 3 years ago. But now that groceries are double what they were 3 years ago, they can't afford to take that payment on. They've been spending that student loan payment on groceries. So what happens when all of a sudden everyone has to start making these student loan payments on October 1st? Well, I'll tell you what happens. Discretionary spending for those people goes away or contracts severely, meaning they go to fewer restaurants, they buy only the things that they need to survive. And then what sort of cascading effect does that have on the economy for these restaurants and retail outlets? When that spending dries up, well, then those firms say, well, we don't need these employees anymore, and the layoffs start. And then those people contract their spending, and it just spreads like a contagion. So, because that's where we are headed with these student loan payments are a big, big deal. I believe it's no doubt about it. We're going to see that soon enough. But there's other things going on throughout the economy. We've talked in the past about commercial real estate and how the occupancy rate is only 50% what it was 4 years ago for a lot of these office properties due to work from home. And these office properties were bought with interest-only loans. 89% of the commercial real estate that has a mortgage, it has an interest-only mortgage. Most of those were taken out at very low rates, but they're for 5-year periods. It's not like a home where they get a 30-year fixed rate. They get this fixed rate for 5 years, and then they have to refinance. And as we've seen rates over the last year skyrocket, they're going to have to refinance those properties at higher rates. Properties that no longer cash flow at what they did before because their tenants have walked away. So what's going to happen? These commercial real estate developers and owners are simply going to walk away from those properties and default, say, well, we're not going to make the payment on this loan. Here you go, bank. It goes back to you. And so the banking system is going to get hit hard again, just as they got hit hard this spring, holding all of these government bonds that declined in value when interest rates were hiked. So we have all of that going on. We have housing, residential housing. We keep hearing about how strong residential housing is. Guys, this is falling apart just as we saw during the financial crisis 15 years ago. We're not yet in the worst of the storm, so people keep saying they think all of this stuff will happen overnight. That's what's going on. So they started hiking rates. Why haven't prices fallen 50% and everything's fallen apart? Well, it takes time for those things to work their way through the system. But guys, it is coming. Let's take a look at this right here. It's a tweet from Wall Street Silver. Again, I know it's called X now and not Twitter. I'm still going to call them tweets. But it says, real estate industry in panic mode, 45% drop in home purchases, bigger than 2008. Home sales are now down 31% in 2023. Now, keep in mind, this is not prices. We're seeing price declines, some larger in other markets than others. Some people will say, no, the prices are the same as they were before, or they're going up. But no doubt about it, fewer homes are selling. And what does that mean? Well, it says here, without transactions, because whatever price the homes sell at, without transactions, many jobs that are commission-oriented are seeing huge declines in incomes. Real estate agents, mortgage brokers, title insurance, home inspectors, all of the various categories are entering a depression from lack of transactions. And as we can see here, again, we're looking at the great financial crisis when we look here. And this is where we are right now. And I would say in just the early innings of this, we've seen mortgage rates in the United States go from fixed rates for a 30-year mortgage of under 3% around 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago probably, to 7-8%, depending on where you are, how much you're putting down, all of these different factors. But so we've almost seen these rates triple. And what does that do? Well, it makes people less likely to buy a house, as we're seeing here in CNBC. It says mortgage demand stalls at a level not seen since 1996. And keep in mind, the population was smaller in 1996. It says the average contract interest rate for 30-year fixed mortgage rates with conforming loan balances increased to 7.27% from 7.21. It says demand for refinances dropped 5% for the week and was 31% lower than the same week 1 year ago. Guys, I have who in the world would refinance right now? I mean, I don't know everybody's situation, but if you're refinancing, it assumes that you were previously financed at what was almost had to be a lower rate, but I guess everybody's situation is different. It says applications for mortgages to purchase a home rose 1% week to week, but were 27% lower than the same week 1 year ago. Again, mortgage demand stalls at a level not seen in 27 years. So housing market is being hit. We're seeing residential housing, commercial real estate, credit card defaults, auto loan defaults. People are in a survival mode just to get by. They've been in a struggling mode. Now many people are in just a struggle to survive. Some people are living in tents and living in cars, and they have full-time jobs, but they cannot afford these prices. And what can't afford to be paid won't be paid. And we have this massive debt load as individuals, as local governments, as national governments, as corporations, these massive debt loads globally that cannot mathematically be paid back. And what won't be paid back will not be paid back. So what does that mean? It means defaults are coming. It means a deflationary period akin to the Great Depression is coming. So I want to take a look at this chart right here. This is from the U.S. Federal Reserve, St. Louis. We've looked at this before, but again, there are new people to this channel that haven't seen this, so I want to explain this. This is the federal funds effective rate. So when you hear about, well, the Fed is raising rates, this is what they're talking about. And while the rate itself is not that high historically, when you look at some of the rates that we had in the late 70s, the early 1980s, the year-over-year change in the rate, which was effectively near zero when the Fed started hiking is a big deal. We've been pointing this chart for a long time. It goes back to the mid-1950s, and we've never seen anything like this. We went to, I think it peaked out at a 5,612% year-over-year increase in the effective Fed funds rate, which trickles down into the rates that we see for credit cards, auto loans, home mortgages, commercial real estate, all the interest rates that are charged within the economy. And we said at the time, this is a mountain. The economy is going to slam into it. Guys, when we see this right here, I know it's coming down. That's because now the year-over-year change is based on the higher rate from the year before. That doesn't mean that it's getting better. What it means is this crash is already baked into the cake, because these rates, they take time to impact the economy. Again, okay, we've seen almost tripling in mortgage rates. Well, that doesn't really bother you unless you have to buy a home, right? If you're living in a home and you purchased it with a 30-year fixed mortgage rate that was 2%, you don't care that the rate is now 8%. But what happens when you lose your job and you have to move to another state to get your new job, and now you have to buy a new house at an 8% mortgage? So as these things have to happen, as people's cars break, a person's car breaks down and they have to buy a new car, all of these things, we're going to see that this starts to happen. Commercial real estate, you may have that low rate now, but next year you have to refinance that property, and then all of a sudden the math doesn't make sense and you default. So you don't see the default right away when they know that that's coming. They wait to see what happens, and then they default. So a lot of the impact from what we're seeing here has not hit the economy yet, but guys, it is coming. This is just the beginning. The worst is yet to come. We see right here in this MoneyWise article, it says Kevin O'Leary warns that real chaos is about to start for the little guy in America. Here's what he means and why he's so worked up. So this is the dude from Shark Tank, if you ever watch that show. It says Kevin O'Leary has warned chaos is about to kick off for the little guy, the 33.2 million small businesses in America, due to the Federal Reserve's aggressive rate hikes. So what we just looked at, guys, this is pretty aggressive right here historically. Nothing like it in decades of data. And so we read down, he says, they're struggling because the Fed has raised rates up to 5.5% in a matter of months. You're going to hear a lot of people crying about this in the next few months because they can't borrow anything anymore and they can't run their businesses. At the same time, O'Leary claims that small businesses with between 5 and 500 employees have been cut off at the regional bank level in the wake of 3 major bank failures in the spring. He said regional banks are no longer willing to loan money to small businesses because they're under pressure from regulators to increase their liquidity. The failures of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank in particular sparked immense stress on America's regional banking industry. If you remember, back in March, we had the springtime between March and May, you had the second, third, and fourth largest bank failures in U.S. history. That is even adjusted for inflation. And you had the size of those banks, the assets that were undermanaged by those banks, collectively were bigger than all of the bank failures of 2008. Yet, all just got swept under the rug because the Fed came into the rescue with this special plan. They were going to, all this currency was printed and given to these banks. But there's a timeline on that where that runs out. And banks have borrowed from that special lending facility $108 billion, which is all due in about 6 months. What are they going to do when that happens? Guess they'll probably extend this further. We'll have to wait and see. But he says the country currently has around 4,100 regional banks, Joe Leary believes will consolidate to around 2,000 in the next few years. Why? Because half of those banks are going to basically go bankrupt, go out of business, and get bought up by their assets. The performing assets will get bought up by the other banks. But he says during that period, people are very nervous about putting their money in the bank because if another one fails and you have your cash in there, right now you're only guaranteed for $250,000, he said, referring to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation guarantee to protect deposits of up to $250,000. Guys, we saw these bank failures before, and let me tell you, more are coming. And what he's talking about here, yes, more are coming. And when it does, panic is going to ensue. And let me tell you why. We'll talk about this a little bit more toward the end of this video. But in the United States, there was legislation passed after the great financial crisis known as Dodd-Frank. And part of Dodd-Frank includes bail-ins rather than bailouts for banking system failures. Now, we saw them ignore that law back in March because, what do laws mean? Who cares about those? Who cares about the Constitution, law and order, whatever. Rule of law, contract law, we'll just throw it all out. But under those rules, and this is, while Dodd-Frank is the U.S. legislation, we saw this rolled out globally. If you live in Cyprus, you know that this was done a few years ago, so you know exactly what we're talking about. But what happens is, if you have more than $250,000 in the bank, and the bank goes under, well, you'll get your $250,000, and anything above that will be used to bail out the bank. They call it a bail-in, and you'll get a little piece of paper, an IOU from the bank, saying you're now a equity holder in the bank, but it's going to be a worthless bank. So let's say you have $1 million in there. Well, $750,000 of it will just disappear. And so when that happens to just one bank, all it takes is one bank. When that happens, there will be absolute panic with people pulling their money out of the banks, people converting that cash into gold, silver, farmland, whatever they can to try to get it out of the way. But the problem we face is, okay, because a lot of people might say, well, I don't have $250,000 in the bank. I don't have $2,000 in the bank, much less $250,000. So what do I care about this? Well, your employer probably does. And so if you work for a local employer and they bank with the local regional bank and they've got $1 million of an account for payroll, and that bank goes under the day before payday, well, you aren't getting paid as an employee, and the company you work for may very well be out of business as of that day. So that's why this is important. So as individuals, we may look at this and go, well, what's the problem, of having, who has more than $250,000 in the bank? Well, businesses do. And that was the problem with Silicon Valley Bank. They had venture capital firms that had billions with a B, $1 billion in a checking account. They should have lost it all. But had they lost it all, it would have caused a domino effect contagion throughout of business bankruptcies and bank runs. And so they papered over that situation. They ignored the law and did what they needed to do. But can they do that for every single bank? Well, that remains to be seen, but I wouldn't count on it. And I would say that just as with Lehman Brothers, because if you remember back in the financial crisis, Bear Stearns went under and got bailed out, right? They got acquired by, I think it was JP Morgan, if I remember correctly. But when it came to Lehman Brothers, the federal government didn't bail them out. They said, well, we can't keep bailing out all these institutions. So they let it fail. And we saw what the consequences of that were. And then all these other institutions started to fail, so they came in and they bailed them all out. Well, we're probably going to see something very similar happen with the regional banks, with all the problems they're having with commercial real estate. But again, guys, think of the contraction in business credit that Kevin O'Leary's talking about. So some firms, for payroll, they have these revolving credit lines, and it's not because they're borrowing in order to pay their employees. What they're doing is they just need a bridge loan. They've sold the goods or they've sold the services. They have an accounts receivable. They don't have the cash yet, but they know it's coming. So they just need a 30-day loan to get from here to there, and then they turn around and pay it all off. Well, when that credit dries up, that business goes under. And so we're in real danger of seeing a credit freeze. Credit is the lifeblood of the financial system, in the same way that energy is the lifeblood of economic activity. There's a direct correlation between energy used and economic output. And in a credit-based fiat system like we have, you need ever-expanding credit in order to keep the system from crashing. And right now we're seeing that credit contracting. So 08, 09, everybody said, oh, well, China's expanding, so everything's going to be wonderful. That'll happen again. The U.S. is hurt, but guys, this is a global problem. Let's look at this right here. This is from CNN Business. It says China's exports and imports fall again in August as demand slumps. It says China's exports fell by 8.8% in August year over year, while imports contracted 7.3%. So keep in mind, exports, all the stuff they're manufacturing in China and sending out to Europe and the United States and all over the world, contracted by 8.8%. Imports, all the things they're buying and bringing into the country, whether it's raw materials to create those products or products for Chinese citizens and Chinese consumers, that contracted 7.3%. Doesn't sound good, guys. That's pretty much their economy. It says customs data showed on Thursday increasing pressure on the country's vast manufacturing sector as demand sags at home and abroad. A Reuters poll of economists had forecast a fall of 9.2% in exports and a drop of 9% in imports. And I love this here. They say the world's second largest economy risks missing Beijing's annual growth target of about 5%. As officials wrestle with a worsening property slump, weak consumer spending, tumbling credit growth, leading analysts to downgrade growth forecasts for the year. So here they're saying, hey, they might miss this 5% growth target. Guys, there's no way they're growing right now. But China lies in the same way that the United States government lies. We see the lies and the government statistics that come out saying, well, inflation is 6%, right? And you're like, but I just went to the grocery store and the dozen eggs I bought last month is up 20%. How are you telling me that it's only 6% annual inflation? Well, they lie. They make up these stats because the entitlement programs are directly tied to this cost of living adjustment and that CPI, that inflation rate that they give. And so it would bankrupt the United States to raise Social Security payments 20% every year to keep up with inflation. So they just lie about what inflation is. Well, in China, it's 10 times worse. So they're sitting here telling us, oh, the Chinese economy is on, we might miss that 5% growth target by a hair. Guys, their exports are down 8.8% a year. Imports are down 7.3% a year. 30% of their economy is residential real estate. And the second largest firm in that industry went bankrupt, Evergrande. Their stock is worth pennies. And the leading firm in that industry, Country Garden, failed to make it would be like you and I not being able to make a payment for 12 cents or something. It's a $187 billion company. And they couldn't make like a $600,000 payment just last week or the week before. Guys, the Chinese economy is imploding, yet they're acting like, oh yeah, well, it's a little down, but they're going to grow fine this year. No, they're not. The United States is going into depression. China is going into depression. This is a global problem. And where have we stated from the beginning, ground zero for that global problem is Europe. And let's look at this data right here. This is another tweet. This one is from Michael A. Arrowet. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but this guy has great data. If you want to go check out this account, lots of charts and graphs on what's going on in the economy. And this one is really sobering. It says Euro area bank lending to households below. So the Euro area bank lending to households is now below what it was during the Great Financial Crisis, the Euro crisis, and the COVID lockdowns. So let's take a bigger look at this chart right here. So we see here, this was the Great Financial Crisis. This was when you had all the European debt problems with Greece, and I don't know if you remember all of that. And then here was COVID. So keep in mind, if you remember what was going on, I mean, in February 2020, Italy, you didn't see a person in the streets. There were no cars on the roads. It was a complete shutdown, lockdown, no economic activity transpiring. And yet, right now, is worse. What does that tell us is going on? And again, credit, this is lending to households. Credit is the lifeblood of the financial system we have. We're seeing it taken away. What is going to be the result of that? More important than credit is energy. Energy is the lifeblood of all economic activity. And where are we seeing the most energy problems? Well, in Europe, we're seeing, these green energy policies that are where Germany has taken nuclear power plants that were perfectly fine operating, had done so for decades, had decades into the future to operate and supply abundant and cheap energy for the German people. Well, we're going to shut them down based on our green policy. Well, what's your replacement policy? We don't have one. Just going to shut them down. Well, we had all this abundant oil and natural gas being piped in from Russia. Well, until Nord Stream got destroyed and we put all those sanctions on Russia. So that's gone. Europe is in real trouble, guys. And so we're looking at the largest economies in the world, the United States, China, Russia, all in contraction. Guys, this is a sign, I believe, that we are in this depression right now. And if you have any history or remembrance of how these things work, the mainstream corporate media, they wake up to this maybe like a year after it's happened. So back in 2008, right up until Lehman Brothers collapsed, everything's fine. Some economists say we aren't even in a recession. Then later they go, oh yeah, it began back in December 2007. That's when the recession began. And you think, well, you told us for all of 2008 up until everything collapsed, the stock market collapsed and millions of people got laid off, that everything was fine. Because that's what they do. Either they're clueless or they're a cheerleader for pushing the narrative that the powers that be want them to push. But they're not telling the truth. They're not trying to uncover facts like we're doing here. So, guys, this is a terrible situation that we're heading into. And again, all of this supposes that, well, everything continues as normal, right? What if there's a black swan event? What if we have an escalation of the war in Ukraine? What if we have, some of these derivatives blow up? There's $2 quadrillion worth of derivatives in the global economy. What if something happens with one of those and we see a financial contagion? But what if, say, China invades Taiwan? Let's look at another tweet of the same guy, Michael A. Arrowet. Says, despite all the talk about Apple moving production out of China, Even in 2025, about 80% of its products will still be manufactured there. Tim Cook, that's the Apple CEO, and Apple board must be praying each day that US-China tensions don't get worse as we go forward. And so here it has this chart of where all the Apple products are made. It says, AirPods is a fairly new and not complicated product, or easier to move out of China, but AirPods without iPhones make less fun than AirPods with iPhones. But seriously, Apple is simply held hostage in US-China tensions. And then we get to the kicker. He says, thought experiment. Imagine the shockwaves through financial markets when Apple stock becomes basically worthless if/when China goes after Taiwan and decides to cut off Apple's supply chain to soften the US response. Banning iPhones for public officials, which they just did, was just a warning salvo. So let's think about that for a moment. If 80% of all the Apple products are produced in China, what happens if China wakes up one day and says, hey, Apple, all these factories, they're ours now. Your mistake for building them here. What happens? And I realize that you're talking about millions of Chinese citizens that are employed by Apple. I don't know that they would do this, but what if they did? He makes an important point here. Apple is a $2.7 trillion company, trillion with a T. 7% of the S&P 500 is Apple. So if you own a 401k, if you own any sort of stock index fund with US stocks, odds are you have Apple stock. And if this happened, you would see that Apple stock plummet, and it would take the entire stock market with it, because the market would plummet down based on Apple being such a big portion of the S&P 500, and then all these algorithms would go sell, and then people would start selling like crazy. Guys, we're in very precarious times right now. I believe panic is coming from when the first bank is bailed in. We're going to see panic like people never saw in 08, 09. Panic we haven't seen since the Great Depression, when we saw the bank runs at that time. Because again, Dodd-Frank says that above $250,000, that FDIC limit, your funds, any funds you have parked at a failed bank, will be used to bail in that bank rather than taxpayer funds bailing out the bank. Of course, it depends on what people with political connections hold money at that institution as to whether it gets bailed out or bailed in. But you can be sure your money will be bailed in. If you don't have those political connections, you're going to be bailed in. And when that happens, then we'll see the real bank runs begin. And guys, I've said this before, but you need to be prepared for a bank holiday. If you don't know what that is, go look it up. It happened during the Great Depression. But if we see enough failures in the economy as a result of these massive interest rate increases we've seen over the past year, then we very well could get to a situation where the credit markets freeze. And if the credit markets freeze, everything's going to come to a halt. So for instance, think about the gasoline that goes in your car, or the milk and eggs that you buy at the grocery store. Well, the farmer takes out a revolving line of credit, just like we talked about before, to make payments for the feed he needs for the cows and all of the other expenses on the farm. And under the idea he'll pay that back when he receives the revenue from the sale of the milk and the sale of the eggs. And then there's a company that transports that milk and eggs from the farm to a wholesaler. And then that wholesaler depends on credit. The transportation company depends on credit. The wholesaler taking those to the grocery store depends on a line of credit. The grocery store depends on a line of credit. Those lines of credit freeze up. Nothing moves. The milk and eggs don't get from the farm to the market. The gasoline doesn't get from the refinery to the gas station. So every Friday, just my advice, I would make sure I had a full tank of gas, and I would make sure that you have at least 3 or 4 weeks of food in your home to feed yourself. Because what would you do if all the restaurants and all the grocery stores, there was no food to be bought from anyone for 2 or 3 weeks? Not saying that's guaranteed to happen, but what if it did? How long would you be able to feed yourself? If the answer is not as long as it takes, then you have a problem you need to work on right now. So, guys, this is very serious. Again, we've been talking about this for quite some time now. I believe we're getting confirmation in the headlines and the data that we're very close to this common knowledge moment where people wake up to the reality of what is happening. And most people won't fully wake up to that until you see the stock market crashing and the headlines about millions of people being laid off from their jobs. But by then it's too late. You need to be preparing now, paying off debt, living by biblical principles. So what do you think? Leave your comments below. What are you seeing on the ground? Are you in Europe? Are you in China? What are you seeing happen? Here in the United States, are you seeing people struggle with student loan payments coming back? There's whole articles on that of people who have made decisions thinking they wouldn't have to make those student loan payments again. And now that they have to choose between, paying their mortgage and buying food. And so what impact is that going to have on the economy? I think we know what that is. And of course, times like this lead to the rise of demagogues. And we've seen revolutions take place, not when people want to see change for change's sake, but when people can't afford to live, they can't afford shelter, they can't afford food. They have no food, they have no shelter, they have no hope. That's when they revolt, and that's when we see massive change. So we may be on the cusp of that because, again, this is a global depression. So I think all of this is setting the stage for central bank digital currency to roll out as the solution from the government, and for, setting the stage for the rise of the Antichrist and all of the events of the tribulation. So let me know what you think. Leave your comments below. Make sure to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. And God willing, I will see you on Monday. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.